to the Money RX for CRNAs podcast, where you go behind the scenes with host Brett Fellows, CFP, as he explores the unique opportunities and challenges facing certified registered nurse anesthetist along the path to financial independence. In each episode, Brett shares expert insights and actionable advice, equipping you with the tools you need to take control of your financial destiny and retire on your terms. And now, here's your host, Brett Fellows.
Welcome to Money RX for CRNAs. In today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the most important financial concepts in retirement planning, called savings rate. Well, why is your savings rate important as a CRNA? For me, it tells me a lot about someone's situation because it tells me if they're living a life to the maximum point on their income. Are they always spread thin, or do they have flexibility to make money decisions? Just this morning, I was analyzing a client and I had to make the decision. Can this person afford to save more money? Because if they can save more money and qualify for a higher tax deduction on their retirement plan, it will bump them into a different tax bracket and save almost $75,000 in federal and state income taxes, if they can make the larger retirement plan contribution. Now, that's all great, but I'm worried about them being able to afford to do that because their lifestyle is also increasing and they're moving into a new house, stretching that savings. So for me, there's actually a consequence to having a low savings rate. And it's not just that you're saving less money or accumulating less for retirement. The consequences are you also pay more taxes when you don't save as much money, especially in the right places. And you also have more stress in your life because your money's just not piling up. And the psychology of that is super important. I think if you have liquidity, and every year when you make money, you know that a good portion of that is going to be left over. And every month, as your deposits continue to grow in your accounts, it's such a different life. And the psychology of living that way is so different than how most people live. So back to why is savings rate so important? For me, measuring someone's savings rate is one of the biggest indicators that says overall their financial situation is stable and we have a lot of options. It's just such a really good indicator of how fast you're going to build net worth and when you'll be able to make work optional. The other thing I think is really helpful about savings rate too is that it answers a lot of other questions people have with their finances. A huge one we get all the time is, how do we know when it's time to invest or pay down debt? And a healthy savings rate will answer that question for you. Having a measurable, a consistent savings rate that's appropriate enough for your income level, that will tell you when it's time to pay down debt. Let me give you an example on this. If someone is saving 8% of their income and they say, you know what, I want to pay down my debt. Well, the way we look at it, when we look at your savings rate is the total possible income you have left over. So it's after taxes and after living expenses and mandatory debt payments. We have this leftover money, and that's what I would consider your savings rate. And so now, with your savings rate, you have some choices where to put it. You can let it pile up in your personal checking account. You can pile it up in your business checking account if you're an independent, or it can be dedicated to a long-term retirement plan, or an after-tax brokerage account, or you could pay down debt with it. And what I think is important to me is to look at someone's possible savings rate and then say, if that's a low number, like it's 7 to 10%, we're probably not at the point in our life where extra debt payments really makes a lot of sense. You instead need to have that savings rate in the 20s, 20% of income, for us to start having a conversation about big lifestyle expenses and increases to your standard of living. And I actually want to expand on that a little more. When people ask me, what's a minimum savings rate? Well, I think we all kind of grew up with the save 10% for yourself, that type of theme. But I don't think that that's anywhere near enough, especially when we look at the data of what CRNAs are used to spending and knowing that it's going to be a similar amount in their working years as it will be in their retirement years. And so at the end of the day, it's really pretty simple math. If you look at the average American, let's say the average income is in the $50,000 range for most U.S. households. And so the percentage of income that Social Security makes up of that $50,000 is something like 70%. So you can save 10% of your income if your income is low, and you're going to be fine when you hit retirement because you've got Social Security producing a slightly reduced income than what you're already used to. On the other hand, if you look at the average CRNA income from the low end of $230,000 to maybe a high end of $500,000 per year, and that's just the average. Many people are earning way more than that and maybe earning less. But regardless, your Social Security income is barely going to cover much of your lifestyle in retirement. What happens is we all get used to spending a certain percentage of our income. The more money you make, the more you spend. So our average client's spending is somewhere in the $20,000 per month range. And so if that's your spending, and Social Security is only like $3,000 of that $20,000, I mean, Social Security just doesn't make even a dent in your lifestyle. So to replace your standard of living in retirement, Social Security is just not going to cut it. It doesn't mean that it's not going to cut it for most people. It just means it doesn't cut it for people who are used to living on much more than the average person, or who earns a lot more, and that's the challenge that a lot of CRNAs face, and why their retirement date is closer to age 70 when the average U.S. citizen's retirement stays closer to age 62. So, back to the question then, what's the appropriate level where you can start increasing your lifestyle or paying down debt, or maybe even investing in more speculative opportunities? I would probably tell anyone, let's first make sure that we can consistently hit a 20% savings rate. And then, only then, we can see what to do after that. So our client's average savings rate, again, on average, is somewhere in the low 20s, high teens. And that's typically where it floats for most income levels. But once you get to higher income ranges, the average savings rate is much higher for CRNAs, maybe the mid to high 20s, especially if you're in the top quartile of CRNA income. Now, if your savings rate is 40% or more, that's really unusual. And that either means your income is probably 7 figures, and frankly, you should be spending that money, having some more fun with it. So anyway, my thought is I like the idea that people have a chance to have a target that they're shooting for. But you have to keep in mind that there's an excessive point, and there's a point where you're just not there yet. And I think if you're below 15%, you're just not really cleaning up where your cash is going. Anything below 15%, there's actually more work you can do. But again, keep in mind, this is all relative. When I talk to CRNAs who are just coming out of school with their first jobs, I think getting to 10% is doable for most people, maybe even 15%. I think if you can't, that's usually telling of something else in your financial life that's kind of out of whack. And it's usually something with debt or personal spending. It's not usually like your taxes are so high that you can't save. It's usually debt or spending. I want to switch gears here and talk about how I see savings rate when instead of investing my savings into some type of an account, I'm instead investing those funds into other assets. And specifically, I want to talk about real estate, because that's what I get asked about the most. I was talking to a client who has an independent practice, and it's really doing well, and she had like a 35% savings rate. But then she decided to build a building, and she went from like a $2,000 a month lease to a $10,000 a month mortgage payment. So I don't take this loan payment and consider that part of her savings rate, do I? But in some level, she's putting money into an asset that will be usable for her net worth in the future. She can sell it or rent it out in the future, and it can be used for her retirement. Or what if you have a low mortgage and you build a big home and now you have a high mortgage? Well, that also affects most likely your savings rate. And here's why. Whether this is into your personal finances, or maybe what if you own your own CRNA practice and you want to build a building? Well, there's just a cost of operations, and some people choose to bear that cost of operations through a big down payment. But ultimately, everyone's going to feel like when you own your own space, whether it's an office building or your home, you're reinvesting in it. You'll do things that you wouldn't normally do if you had, say, a lease or a rent instead of a mortgage. I mean, if you rent your primary residence or you lease office space, and you know that in 10 years you're going to leave it, it's just emotionally, I think, dangerous to build your own building and refinish it. It's a dangerous financial situation, not because you shouldn't do it, but because emotionally, I think you can get overly invested in the physical structure itself. And guess what? You don't always get the money out on the back end. Usually real estate will appreciate because there's a scarce land and scarce property. And if you buy it in a really great location, yes, it will appreciate. The structure will appreciate over time. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that if someone had a 0% savings rate and they're like, but I'm building massive equity in all of these properties, I'd still say that's really imbalanced and it's not a liquid and you're not as flexible. But again, personal finance is personal. If you've bought property, you probably made the best decisions that you could have made given the resources you had. And so will your savings rate be slightly less as a consequence of that decision? Well, of course. But should it be drastically less? Hopefully not. And I can't tell you on the business owner side how many buildings that I've seen in poor locations that are extremely nice buildings. And I'm amazed that they're just sitting there. They're like a $2.5 million building. But someone obviously got to a point where they just said, you know what? At least I can own it instead of leasing it. At least I'll own this property. And my lease is $10,000 a month, but my mortgage payment is not going to be that much. Maybe it's only $7,000 a month. So instead, let's just build our own as opposed to leasing. And what happens is, with the lease, you get a significant tax deduction every time you make that payment. And you don't have any obligation when you're done. On the other hand, with a purchase, you invest a lot of money. You do have the time value of money of your 20 to 30% down payment. You have this baggage you now have to deal with. And I have a lot of clients that after 30 years of owning their building actually are kind of stuck with their building and they're trying to figure out, what do I do with this thing? Again, I'm not saying don't own your real estate. I'm just saying don't make that the rationale for why you don't have a high savings rate. I know that's my answer, but you might be able to tell I do struggle with it. I think it's tough because it's difficult to say which one is right or wrong because some people don't have aspirations to maximize their net worth, believe it or not. They're not trying to blow their net worth out and become the wealthiest person that they know. They're just saying, look, I really want to have a good life. I don't mind working late into my 60s or even my 70s. I just want to have a balanced work life and I want to have a really nice house. And that's just what I want. And that's my choice. So don't tell me that I have to have a 25% savings rate because you know what? I'm fine at 16. I'm fine at 18. I want a really nice house. And yes, I'm going to save money, but I'm okay if I'm not going to do it as fast as everyone else. So I think it really does boil down to, look, you can make your own decision, but my role as the financial advisor, it's actually not to make you the wealthiest person ever, but it's more importantly to protect you from making decisions that you're probably going to regret. And this I can tell you from experience. I can't tell you how many times someone values a primary residence and wants to reduce their savings rate to do that. they do end up regretting spending too much on that house when they look back, and doing too much of a decline in their savings rate and not accumulating enough money. They still regret it 20 to 30 years later. So therefore, it's my job then to say, look, I get this. This is what you value, but I think I've got to push you a little bit in this direction. And I think that's where measuring someone's savings rate really comes into account. Because if you're saying it drops 1% by buying that house, well, then I'd say, yeah, you're probably in the no mistake range. But if someone's going to take 15 to 25% of their savings, well, then guess what? It's going to extend their working life 8 years. Well, that's their decision. I can't help them with that. Ultimately, where I'm going with this is that it shouldn't really be a gut feel kind of thing. You really do want to quantify it. Now, the last question I get a lot about savings rate that I want to bring up is, okay, Brett, so I saved 20% of my money. Where do I put it? Now, as you can imagine, there is no absolute answer to this. It is very much will depend on your personal situation. It is a very individual answer. But let me give you some examples. Let's say you have 2 CRNAs, and they are very similar in their income level and their savings rate. One of them might be tiling a ton of money into a qualified plan, and that works for him. And I'm talking about a 401k or a 403b or pension or profit sharing plan. But that doesn't mean that the second CRNA should follow them, even if they have a lot of other identical things. And we do see this scenario a lot of times. Many people will have a 403b or a 401k account at the office, and all of their money goes into it. That's all their savings, and there's no liquidity. But where you put it is just really individual depending upon your situation. A lot of people have projects coming up. They know they're going to move. They know they want a second location. They know they want to remodel their house or have to move their family somewhere. And so you have to understand that financial planning is about putting money to the highest priority things first, the most important things first. And sometimes that is really liquid conservative cash or conservative investments to get ready for a purchase. So the line you pick where your savings will go really doesn't matter because you're going to use that cash. But I think a mistake that can be made really easily, and I hear this a lot too, the intuitive thing is to jump into the product. Where should my money go? And then you just start talking about what type of accounts or what type of insurance policy or something like that, what type of investment. When the real answer will come from doing the planning first. That is the financial version of doing a patient assessment first. And my hope is that this might be insightful for some of you to hear, because I think that when the average person thinks about savings, you're thinking about money that I'm putting away for retirement. When I talk with clients about savings, I'm actually at a step before that. I'm saying how much money is left over after taxes and mandatory debt payments to work with. Then let's decide where we'll go. Like when we do an initial pre-op assessment with a prospective client, we start with, what's your income? Because from there I can figure how much tax you're going to have to pay. And then once I know what your debt payments are, and then once I know what your spending is, I can say what you're probably going to have left over. And I do all of that before a client even begins to tell me where they're actually putting their money. A lot of people will initially tell me they're saving money somewhere. They're putting money here and there. But I don't really care where it's going right now. I know people are putting money in places, but I want to back up before that and find out what is the total number first. Because the savings rate, the percentage of your total income that you can do something with, you have control over, that is the starting point. Now, if that number is already too low, well, then we have to look above in the other areas. The debt may be structured poorly, or maybe your interest rates are too high. It could be that maybe your income is just too low. And so the fundamental first step in financial planning is to take a look at your income level and saying, for someone who's your age, who's earned this much money and has been practicing as a CRNA for this long, Does your savings rate look right compared to others? And I know the way to compare that and say to a client, for a 41-year-old at your stage of your career, I'm really surprised that your savings rate is this low. Or, man, you have a killer savings rate. It's just time to start allocating it to the right places or spending more. A lot of times, it's just because you haven't done any financial planning for like a decade. But now it's time. So savings rate really does depend on the individual. And I actually consider this a healthy savings rate. Let's say that your savings does need to go towards extra debt payments to be able to eliminate a couple of loans. That savings rate's actually pretty healthy. You just took on a lot of debt, or the place you went to school is just way more expensive than the average person, or you have to live in an expensive city where housing just is what it is, or you want a house and you don't want to keep renting. So we need to dedicate that to a down payment first. Ultimately, it's about balance and saying, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, then I want this to have my lifestyle. I have to balance it out. Everyone's got these things that they have to do or that they want. I think that there are times in your life when they're just more valuable than others. Things are more valuable in your 30s or 40s or 50s than maybe your 70s. So it's okay to have those preferences. But you've got to find a line that works for you and build a plan that you feel happy about. And remember this, when it comes to financial planning, the simpler you can make things, you don't need more complexity in your life. Keep things simple, like where your money goes, to make good progress. You do not need a million things going on at the same time. That will derail a plan when there's too much going on. And also keep in mind that life is not linear. What you did one year doesn't necessarily mean you'll do it next year in terms of retirement planning or liquidity or debt reduction. Things change, things come up. Just do your best to keep it as simple as possible at all times. And that's just the life events. You're also going to change over time. Your personality will change. Your goals, who you are as a CRNA, starts to evolve. You'll surprise yourself the way you look at money year by year. It will change as you age. And it's important to address those changes and put them into perspective with the financial plan that's designed for you. All right, let me begin to wrap this up. I have 4 points for you to take away from this episode. Number 1, there is always a scenario that can take you out of the game. I think this is good to keep in mind because the best plans you may have and the best you try to predict where you're headed, there will always be something that will happen to that plan. Number 2, don't be a victim of random acts of money. What do I mean by random acts of money? That's throwing arbitrary amounts of money at things based on the pressure you're feeling or the stress or the excitement, whatever, at the given moment. I feel like this is one of the biggest things that causes some kind of financial despair or destruction for people. I think people would be surprised to know, the more you study about human psychology and human behavior, the more you realize how many decisions are literally made purely out of emotion and have nothing to do with logic. We all like to think of ourselves as rational people. We think that we're very logical. And we make decisions because we thought it through and it's the right choice. But a lot of research has been done on all of our decisions, not just financial ones, but they're especially relating to the conscious mind. And what they found is that most of our decisions are triggered by emotion or the reaction that we're trying to get. And nowhere is this more applicable than when we make decisions about money. Number 3, so I think a good baseline savings rate to have is to try to hit a 20% consistent savings rate. Sometimes your income situation won't allow for that. Sometimes it will allow for a lot more than that. But that would be a really good baseline for you to start with before you start thinking about putting money in other places. And the consistent savings is the key. And this is for those of you in the median income, people probably in the mid 200,000 income range. If you start to get a lot higher than that, you should see that savings rate increase. And if you're not seeing your savings rate approach 30% As your income gets into the top quartile of CRNA salaries, then your income savings rate needs to be significantly higher than the average savings rate because you won't be able to replace your standard of living. And it's going to result in an extended working career, which if you're consciously aware of this, that's okay. But you will have to have a higher savings rate than 20%. And please keep in mind again, these are ranges. These are not an exact number I want you to necessarily remember. Your savings rate should be between 10 to 30% of your income level. And if it's at 40, well, we're probably going to encourage you to spend more. Or if it's just 10% year after year, well, guess what? You're going to continue to struggle, and it's going to take until you hit Social Security where you can perhaps feel that you're comfortable enough where you can stop working. Number 4 and final, treat your savings like bill pay. Try to automate it as much as possible. I get that some situations don't allow that all the time, and things are moving fast, and your pay can be variable. But just try to automate it as much as possible. I promise you, it will make it so much easier. All right, I'm wrapping it up for today. I hope you found today's episode helpful as you think about your savings rate. Again, given that everyone is different and everyone has unique needs and circumstances when it comes to how much they should be saving, it's nearly impossible for me to cover everything. So if you have any unanswered questions about your savings rate or Social Security or taxes in retirement, especially when it comes to your financial plan, or maybe you need a recommendation or a resource, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can shoot me a note. My direct email is brett@oakcapitaladvisor.com, or you can directly schedule time with me by going to our website, oakcapitaladvisor.com, and click the free pre-op assessment link, where you can schedule a call with me at your convenience. Take a minute, too, to give the show a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd really appreciate that. And that would make it a lot easier for other CRNAs to find us when they're searching for podcasts. Thank you for listening to this episode of Money RX for CRNAs, and have a great week.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. This podcast does not engage in rendering legal, financial, or other professional services.